So recognition and classification. These are just sort of broad rule of thumb ideas to get you thinking and might help you group ASD students you've had in the past or ASD students you have now currently in your class into certain areas. And then I'll explain the types of ASD students that are most common in our high school setting. So the first thing to remember is basically, this is kind of like a dogmatic rule that we learnt over and over from basically anyone who spoke to us in the course that I just completed on autism spectrum disorder. And that was that if you've met one person with ASD, you've met one person with ASD. It's a very wide spectrum of disorders, and every student you meet with this diagnosis will be dramatically and in surprising ways different to one another. But with that out of the way, there's sort of some general broad stroke things that you need to know. Of the ASD population, 90% of them are male and 10% of them are female. Why that is quite complicated. But as a general rule of thumb, if you have a class of only ASD students, 90% of them will be male and 10% of them will be female. Within our classroom setting, 1/3 of the students with ASD will be diagnosed and 2/3 of those will be undiagnosed, which is why I've talked a lot about recognition and spotting students that may have ASD. And as a general rule of thumb, I mean, if you, for some reason, falsely recognize a student as potentially having ASD and you put in place strategies to assist that student, there's basically nothing you can do wrong, in the sense that the strategies you're putting in place for that student, whether they have ASD or not, will be useful. And as a general rule, if you're doing them properly, they'll be useful for your entire class as well. So students with ASD will have what we call a spiky profile, which basically means they'll have significant strengths and significant weaknesses. If you understand the concept of neuroplasticity, in my opinion, I believe that basically everyone's brain accommodates for what it's most able to do, and therefore you get extreme strengths. So in students with ASD, these are just a little bit more pronounced than in your neurotypical child. So, whereas I might say I'm not great at maths, I'm actually quite reasonable at it, but my clear strengths would be, say, English, history, and the things that I teach. But if pressed, I'm not bad at science and other things, and so on. Whereas a student with ASD is much more likely to have less of a sort of moderate band with one or two peaks. It's much more likely to have extreme peaks and extreme troughs. This is especially true in a high school setting where all of the students, for the most part, do a lot of compulsory subjects. There is a general tendency towards maths and science subjects being a strength, and things like sport and outdoor ed being weaknesses, as well as English and humanities, because they're a little bit less clear and a little bit more wishy-washy, depending on the way they're taught, of course. But again, if you have a student with ASD in your class and you look up their compass results, you could quite often see this spiky profile. And the then important thing for you as a teacher is, if you are part of the spike, then you have an expert in your class who may even know your subject area better than you. But of course, it's the opposite. If you are one of the troughs in the spiky profile, you're going to have to work especially hard to tap into interest to get that student to engage with your subject in a way that will be beneficial and useful to them down the track. So in terms of high school, you have to think that we're sort of like a very narrow catwalk or conveyor belt. And branching off from there, you have SDS schools, which are special developmental schools for students with IQs of 80 or 60 or lower, depending on the school that they're in. Then there's autism-specific schools. There's transition units, which are more for ASD students who are, for whatever reason, out of the mainstream system, but intend to be transitioned back in. And then there's just your standard special schools as well. So because of there being so many other options and high school being such a narrow conveyor belt, typically the transition between primary school and secondary school is where you see the greatest change. And quite often in the younger years at a high school, we see students who probably should be in one of these other settings. And it's important for you as a teacher to be aware of the other settings and what they do, so that you can sort of suggest that maybe the student that you have in front of you isn't necessarily in the best place to support their learning. Just generally speaking, in our setting, ASD students may be disorganized and have problems completing work or submitting incomplete or unfinished work. Again, of course, that's not really a surprise to anyone talking about any student anywhere, but it is especially something that has been observed in ASD students as well. That which we call avoidant or aloof, passive and active but odd. We very rarely get those students which would be defined as active but odd, which is that they're very active and very engaging with social situations, but in a strange way that sort of subverts or breaks the rules that they're aware of. What we're more likely to get is the passive students who are quite happy to go with the flow and sort of fit into a system and don't cause too many behavioural issues. And less likely, but also quite common in our schools, is the avoidant or aloof category, which is where they're sort of withdrawn from things and avoid social contact frequently. So one issue for students with ASD is impulse control. Again, because of what I just said about the three categories and the types of students that we typically get in a high school setting, this is not too much of a pressing concern for us, but just be aware that impulse control can be something that is challenging for ASD students in your class.